I'll be speaking to Sam Farber. He's Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Brooklyn College. He's written a number of books on Cuba, including Revolution and Reaction in Cuba and The Origins of the Cuban Revolution Reconsidered. His newest book with the Haymarket Press is The Politics of Che Guevara. Of course, we're speaking just a few days after the death of Fidel Castro. Farber has at least two articles published in the media that I know of, one in These Times and the other in the British paper, The Guardian. Good morning.
Good morning, Stan. Good to talk to you.
Now, your family is from Cuba, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
From where? Which part?
From Marianao, which is a city which was immediately west of Havana.
And when did your family come to the U.S.?
Well, my family came to the U.S. After the revolution. That is my parents, but my brother and I emigrated before the victory of the revolution. So it's about a half and half, if you will.
So how old were you about in 1959?
I was about to be 20 years old.
So what about, were you involved in politics in Cuba in the 50s?
When I was in high school, in the public high school, from 1951 to 1956, Batista, I was born in 1939, Batista school took place during my first year in high school, from 51 to 52. And that was really the origins of my politicization, because I got involved in high school political activities against the dictatorship, and I was elected delegate to the student association. And when we talk about a student association in the Cuba of those days, we are not certainly talking about U.S.-style student governments. These were political bodies, even though we were teenagers. And essentially, when it came to political demonstrations and things of that sort, we acted as a support troops for the university students. That when they had a strike, they would contact us by phone or send somebody in person, since we were not that far away, to ask us to support him, which we usually did.
And you were trying to get the dictator Batista removed.
Correct.
Well, let's now jump ahead to today. There's going to be huge crowds at memorials in Cuba for Fidel. But we know that states can deliver big, seemingly enthusiastic crowds. What about what's going on in Cuba? Do you think there's genuine sentiment for Fidel?
Yeah, I think that there's both. I have no doubt, particularly among the older generation, because in Cuba today, there is a huge, not the only country in the world, of course, but in the case of Cuba in particular, there is a huge generational difference between people that grew up before 1990. And 1990 is a key date because that is the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had a tremendous impact on the Cuban economy and Cuban society, more broadly speaking. So people who are in their 40s and higher, much larger proportion of those people will be supportive of the government, whether enthusiastically or less enthusiastically, but to one degree or another will be more identified with the Cuban government than among younger people, where the disillusion and apathy and wanting to get out of the country has become very, very extended. That doesn't mean that those younger people are ready to jump and start fighting the government or opposing it in the streets or anything like that. It means that there's a tremendous disillusion and, more than anything else, the lack of any hope in that things are going to get better in Cuba. And that's why there has been such huge immigration. And I think there will be likely another push if there is any kind of notion that Donald Trump is going to repeal the Cuban Adjustment Act, which is the law that makes Cubans relatively easy for Cubans to obtain U.S. residence.
Mm. Now, what is Fidel most admired for by those who like him? Is it the fact that he stood up to the United States in imperialism?
I think in the case of Cuba, that is certainly an important part of it, because there was, after the Victorious Revolution, I want to emphasize that very much, before the Victorious Revolution on January 1st, 1959, anti-imperialism had been dormant in Cuba since the 30s. It was a 20-year period from, I would say, roughly from the late 30s to the late 50s, where anti-imperialism, for a variety of reasons that I cannot go into in this moment, anti-imperialism almost disappeared from the political scene, except among the relatively small number of Communist Party members. So there was anti-imperialist attitude that was reborn after the victory of the Cuban Revolution on January 1st, and there was a significant improvement in living standards for the majority of the population, by which I mean that certain basic needs were assured. It was an austere, even Spartan life, but with security. And I think that the key word here is security, and with particular security in questions like education and health. And that's pretty much the situation that prevailed in Cuba from 5960 until 1990. Then, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, living standards in Cuba took a dramatic drop, and that has affected very much health and education. There is Cuba has used the large number of doctors in Cuba as an export, to earn foreign exchange, whether in the earn oil in the case of Venezuela, and the Cuban doctors are exchanged for oil, or for straight money in other global South countries. So that has had a negative impact on medical attention inside Cuba, particularly when it comes to specialists. And similarly, there has been a very widespread deterioration of the medical and school systems. To give you an example, at the beginning of the current school year, 350 school buildings were closed because they were found to be unsafe. So that gives you an idea of the impact that the collapse of the Soviet bloc had. So while the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc, more broadly speaking, were subsidizing the Cuban economy, the Cuban government was able to finance a fairly elaborate welfare state. Mm-hmm. And that fell into crisis until this day.
And of course, during those years, well, and continuing, we still have the blockade, where the U.S. has done the best to cripple the Cuban economy. In one of your articles, you called it a criminal blockade.
Absolutely, and I reiterate that. However, I think it's important also to realize that the economic impact of the blockade was much more heavier at the beginning in the 60s, when the whole equipment of factories and the whole transport system and everything was American or British, although the British never supported the blockade. No other capitalist country supported the economic blockade of Cuba. But it was much more felt at that time than in years since, when the whole economy was readjusted to equipment from the Soviet bloc. So, for example, the lack of spare parts was not as anywhere near as much of a problem as it had been in the early 60s.
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, it continued to be a problem. And Obama, in his policy towards Cuba, tried to get around the legislation, particularly the Helms-Burton Act, that was approved and signed, let's not forget, that by President Clinton in 1996, that limited the extent to which this new policy of Obama could be changed. But in all honesty, he did a lot to try to go around those legal prohibitions to circumvent that. But no question about it that the restrictions of the blockade are, for forbidding investment in Cuba, even though they have managed to get around it by some hotel chains investing in the administration of Cuban hotels, if you follow me, as opposed to the building of new hotels. But no question about the fact that continues to be, and it is criminal, and I emphasize that, but all I'm trying to say is that the impact has been less in recent years compared to what the initial impact, which was very, very serious back in the 60s.
Let's talk about questions of democracy and socialism. Cuba is not a democracy in any kind of way. Forget about counter-revolutionaries, but if you want to have a rival socialist party or a trade union or an independent paper, what's the story with that? You're not allowed to do any of those things.
That is absolutely true.
And what happens if people try?
Well, there is a lot of there has been a change in the tactical repression under Raúl compared to Fidel Castro. There were a very large number of political prisoners under Fidel that had gotten very long prison sentences for essentially non-violent. The great majority of them. There were some that had engaged in violent action, but the great majority of the political dissidents was non-violent, and they would get heavy sentences for political crimes. Under Raúl, the number of political prisoners has declined to a relatively small number, maybe 100 or something like that. But what he has increased, on the other hand, was the frequency and number of short-term arrests. Suppose, for example, that some group of dissidents wants to plan a demonstration for, say, a week from now. So 2 or 3 days before that demonstration, the police will go and raid their homes and arrest them until, say, a week after the demonstration was supposed to take place. So they will be in prison for a couple of weeks with the purpose of disrupting and preventing any kind of protests, and usually they are non-violent protests. So the repressive machinery is still very effective in forestalling any public protest, but they do so in a different manner, and a manner that is much less likely to arouse world disapproval than it was the case under Fidel.
Now, a lot of this is excused by, well, I'll call it the Stalinist left, even many liberals who say, well, what do you expect? Cuba was under the gun. The U.S. Was trying to overthrow the government. There was, hundreds of assassination attempts at Fidel. They had to use dictatorial means and so on and so forth. What do you think of those defenses?
I think that there are a number of what I consider serious misconceptions in this. In the first place, there is this notion that the development of capital C communism in Cuba, the one-party state, and the repression that goes along with it was purely in response to the United States policy. And that, I think, is a serious misconception, because what that is missing is the political ideology and political inclinations of the revolutionary leaders. These were not just people who had a blank heads in which the United States, which just merely reacted to a foreign stimuli. They had their own ideas. And clearly, both, for example, Raúl Castro and Che Guevara, Raúl Castro had been a member of the communist youth in Cuba. Che Guevara, who was the most honest of all the revolutionary leaders, was an admitted admirer of Joe Stanley himself, and he only began to develop criticism of the Soviet Union, even of Stanley, much later, as a year after the Cuban system had already been solidified, and he was not even in power anymore. As I have explained in some detail in my recent book on Che Guevara. But the fact of the matter is that there were authoritarian ideas in the revolutionary leaders that were not, and inclinations that were not dependent on what the United States did. That's number one. Number two, there are measures that are understandable in reaction to foreign interference and foreign threat, and others that are not justifiable in those cases. I'll give you an example. A couple of days before the Bay of Pigs invasion of April 61, the Cuban government rounded up, I don't know, like 100,000 suspected opponents and kept them under lock and key until the invasion had been defeated. That is, in my opinion, justifiable. That is, there is a foreign threat, a real foreign threat, not an imaginary one, and they took the measures to defend themselves. That is perfectly understandable. But there's a big difference between a measure like that, which is by its very essence temporary, in reaction to a foreign threat, and the institutionalization, and I emphasize institutionalization, of a system of repression that is permanent. Because what I want to emphasize is that that kind of foreign threat, as that of the Cuban invasion, or what was likely to happen in the missile crisis of October '62, that system has continued to exist to this very day, where the situation had changed. For example, nobody could claim that as Obama was reestablishing relations with Cuba, and that he was relaxing the situation, that it was about to be an invasion of Cuba at the U.S. That would be total nonsense. So, nonetheless, the repressive activities continued. And that's, I think, is what people confuse, and a lot of the people who confuse that is because in reality, let's be honest about it, they don't really object to the one-party statement of repression.
Mm-hmm. And there's the whole question is if there was democracy and different opinions that were taken seriously, maybe some of the really dreadful errors that the government made might not have happened.
I couldn't agree more. And and there's another aspect to this, which is the economic irrationality of the Cuban government, in particular Fidel Castro himself, has to do with the fact that it's a personal dictatorship. For example, in 1970, Fidel Castro had this fantasy idea that they could have an annual crop. Sugar crops in Cuba typically have been 5, 6, even 7 million tons, and he could have a 10 million sugar ton, which was lunacy. And not only he failed to achieve the 10 million tons, but it was massive disruption of the rest of the economy, because everything was sort of, so to speak, interrupted and sometimes even paralyzed in order to achieve the 10 million tons. Before he was forced to leave office because of his poor health, he had the so-called battle of ideas, which was essentially a very economically incoherent economic intervention in the Cuban economy, also accompanied by a very intrusive micromanagement. Mm-hmm. And in this sense, Raúl is very different, from Fidel. Raúl is far more of a classical bureaucrat, if you know what I'm saying, mm-hmm. than this micromanager that Fidel Castro tended to be, arriving at a factory and first of all, he knew about everything. There was no field of endeavor that he was not an expert on.
Fidel,
which is also typical of a sort of megalomania, And he would come and tell people what to do. I can tell you, for example, this is from personal knowledge of people who were architects and engineers in Cuba working under the regime, and there was the plan to construct a highway that would traverse the island east to west. Because Cuba has very little distances between north and south, but east to west is a very, very long island. It's like 800 miles long. It's quite long. So these architect engineers had the idea. There was sort of a 4-lane highway, 2 lanes on each side. That was not good enough for Castro. It had to be 8 lanes, which economically made absolutely no sense. So they proceeded to build an 8-lane highway because Fidel Castro, in his supposed expertise on civil engineering, which he also apparently claimed to have, he decided that 4 lanes was not good enough, and they were going to... So this kind of gigantism, this kind of gigantic thing is very typical of the economic policies of people who have unlimited power.
Now, speaking of that, let's jump into foreign policy. Let's talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis and something rather sensational that's brought up every once in a while, and then it was on PBS, I think, again very recently. But let's just talk about the background before we get into the sensational business. The invasion, Bay of Pigs had occurred. It was unsuccessful. And then the Soviet Union delivers all kinds of weapons to Cuba, including missiles and nuclear. We know that now. I mean, was it legal for Castro to do that, to bring those weapons?
Well, I don't know exactly what they mean by legal. Cuba had not signed at the time. I don't think there was any kind of nuclear proliferation agreement at that time, and certainly Cuba would have been irrelevant since nobody expected Cuba to have the capacity for such kind of weapons. I think in many ways what the Soviet Union did, it comes to mind Mao saying, which, and I believe you me, I'm no admirer of Mao at all, quite the opposite, but he said something that had made some sense. It says, Mao said something to the effect, I don't remember the exact words, that he was reckless to install them in the first place and chicken shit to withdraw them in the second place. So, because Khrushchev didn't come out looking very well in this situation, and for all I know, although I'm not sure about that, it may have contributed to his downfall in 1964. 2 years later, of course, he was replaced as the head of the Soviet Union.
I guess what I was getting back at was that, I mean, the U.S. had nuclear missiles right in Turkey near Soviet Union, and
that is absolutely true.
It's kind of hypocritical to say that Cuba couldn't have them, whether it was a good idea or not.
Right. You're absolutely right. It was a sheer hypocrisy, and by the way, there was tremendous dishonesty in the part of the U.S. because, in fact, secretly they had agreed, I think, in exchange to withdraw the missiles from Turkey if Khrushchev withdrew the missiles from Cuba, but it was not published at the time, and the Soviets agreed to keep it quiet in order to allow Kennedy to save face. But that was part of the agreement. It was a secret part of the agreement, which was the U.S. to withdraw from Turkey, which was which was at least an implicit admission that they had as much or as little right to put the missiles in Turkey as the Soviets had to put the missiles in Cuba.
All right, now to what I regard as sensational. Some letters, one from Fidel to Khrushchev and another from Khrushchev to Fidel, right after the missile. Well, one was during the missile crisis. I hope I'm not confusing it. But basically, Fidel is saying, if they invade us, use nuclear weapons against the United States. And then Khrushchev sends a letter after the whole thing is done and saying, well, we made this deal. I know you're not happy with all of it. But, hey, by the way, your idea of sending that you wanted us to shoot nuclear missiles at the United States was really wrong, and it would have been thermonuclear war, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, is that stuff true? Is that genuine?
Yeah, I think it is true, and Khrushchev in this instance was right, but let's not forget another side of this issue. And another side of this issue is that after the Soviet Union and Cuba made an agreement to allow the missiles in Cuba, then Khrushchev withdrew them without consulting the Cuban government. So that was a legitimate reason for the Cuban government, would it be Fidel or anybody else for that matter, to be completely enraged as they were, that they were treated as hired help. And Khrushchev made a deal with Washington, and they didn't even bother to go through the motions of consulting the Cuban government. And that created a tremendous reaction in Cuba. And there was a demonstration which was addressed by Fidel Castro, and there was a clamor from the audience diciendo, ni quita, lo que se da no se quita, which rhymes in Spanish, meaning, ni quita, what you give, you cannot take away.
But what about the idea that Fidel was, essentially saying if they invade, burn everything down? I mean, you think Cubans would have agreed to that?
I don't disagree with you. That was a completely reckless and truly adventuristic statement and proposal to make.
Yeah.
That the Soviets were not about to go along for all sorts of reasons, had nothing to do with humanitarianism. In any case, the Soviets had operational control of the missiles in Cuba that had warheads, and that already had installed warheads, and that was not established until many years later. What people knew at the time was that there were missiles in Cuba that could be armed with warheads. But apparently, not apparently, as it emerged later, they already had the warheads installed, but the operational control, contrary to what some people like Carlos Franchi, which claim that Fidel himself has shut down the plane. There was a plane, an American U-2 plane that was shut down over Cuba, that Fidel Castro had shot the plane down. That's total nonsense. The Russians had complete and total control, operational control of the missiles with the warheads that were in Cuba.
Let me jump to another continent, to Africa. One area that, at least on the left, that Fidel is very admired for is what they did in Angola, essentially defeating the South African army and probably driving the final nail into apartheid. Is that pretty much what happened?
Yeah, I think that there's no doubt that the South African defeat at the hands of the Cuban army, and it's important to underline, this was conventional warfare. And what I mean by that, this is not guerrilla warfare we're talking about. These are tanks, planes, infantry. Between Cuba and South Africa, and there was the famous Battle of Cuito-Cuana Valley, where the Cuban armed forces defeated the South African armed forces. This was conventional warfare. It's fairly clear that the defeat of South Africa at the hands of the Cubans, with the help of the Angolans, obviously, accelerated the demise of apartheid. I don't think one can say that by itself defeated apartheid, because I think there was a long-standing political and economic pressures that sooner or later would have defeated apartheid. But nevertheless, it can certainly be said it accelerated. But of course, most important, it allowed the MPLA in Angola to defeat the right-wing opposition of UNITA and other elements that were essentially being paid off by the U.S. State Department. That is true. What is, however, ignored is Cuban intervention in Angola and South Africa and Namibia was, let's call it, left-wing or progressive, if you prefer. It was very different in the Horn of Africa, because Cuba sent in what was literally a war of choice, not a war of necessity or a war for defense, self-determination. Cuba sent 17,000 troops to the Horn of Africa to fight for Ethiopia in the Ogaden. Now, what business is a totally different issue than the one in Angola and South Africa. And they provided massive indirect help. They provided massive help to the Ethiopian government that allowed the Ethiopian government to fight the Eritrean independence movement. And
which
Fidel
was
Castro
totally reactionary. Which was
absolutely. Fidel Castro gives this speech in Cuba, attacking Eritrean independence, saying that it was similar to the South trying to become independent from the North in the Civil War in the United States, which is sheer nonsense, because the South was not a different nation, and Eritrea was a different nation than Ethiopia.
Yeah. And
Ethiopia was a poor man's empire, a tiny empire, but it was an empire, suppressing other nations in the area, which is what Haile Selassie had done.
I mean,
so Ortega, which was this quote-unquote left-wing, what it was a bloody dictatorship. That's what it was. They were killing each other like flies, among the group themselves. it was supported by the Cubans, and supported very substantially. As I said before, at one point there were 17,000 Cuban troops fighting to support Ethiopian policy.
And that jumps me ahead to Syria today, where Fidel supports, well, at least verbally, Assad. Assad,
right.
and made all kinds of statements. I mean, I know a number of Syrians and Syrian supporters are very bitter against the Cuban government
right.
because they're supporting this horror Assad.
Yeah, there is no doubt. Well, by the way, there isn't much stuff in the Cuban press about it as there would have been at the time, but there's no doubt that they do, and there is no doubt that that it plays an important part in the overall politics of the Cuban government, which is to support all sorts of quote-unquote left-wing, for example, much more prominent in Cuban propaganda is the support for Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. And Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, the Sandinistas, so-called in quotes, Sandinistas of today are radically different, really, from the Sandinistas of 1979, and where they have adopted extreme legislation against abortion in Nicaragua. It is really fake, and I use that word deliberately, it's a fake revolutionary government in Nicaragua. The Cubans support to the hilt and do give a lot of publicity to that. In the case of Syria, you're absolutely right. They provide that support, but in a much lower key than they do in terms of lower key. By that I mean the propaganda in the Cuban press, than they do in the case of a country like Nicaragua. That is, I think it's disgraceful that they do.
We've been talking about a half hour, and I don't want to take up your whole day, but I just wanted to conclude. You talked about where Cuba is going now, and you mentioned that, you talked about the Sino-Vietnamese model. Now, Fidel is gone, his brother is running things. What is this Sino-Vietnamese model, and what might that be?
Well, what I mean by that is obviously not that Cuba can do what China can do. That would be absurd. Cuba has 11 million people, and China has 1.2 billion or something like that. So it's not this. But what I mean by that, and Vietnam is also 70, 80 million people. What I mean by that is a political economic model where political dictatorship, authoritarianism, whatever you prefer to call it, coexists with an opening to private enterprise and to capitalism. The Cubans have gone much less farther than the Vietnamese and the Chinese have gone, because in a certain sense they want to have their cake and eat it too. That is, they want to give opportunities for private enterprise in Cuba and at the same time maintain government control, so they end up sitting between two stools. But I think once Raúl Castro passes on the scene, because Fidel really has been out of power in any operational sense for about 10 years now, before he died. In the last 10 years, he wasn't really running Cuba because of illness. But when Raúl goes, and he's 85 years old, so he has, 4 or 5 more years at most. He's supposed to stop being Cuba's president in 2018, but nothing has been said about the leadership of the Cuban Communist Party. So he may, nobody knows for certain, he may stop being president in 2018, but continue to be the General Secretary of the Cuban Communist Party. So in that case, what would it mean in reality? Probably not much. Be that as it may, he only has so many more years to go because the biological clock is unforgiving. So it may be that under the second generation of the Cuban leadership, they will go more full-fledged into that model. We don't know. The coming to power of Trump also introduces a new variant on the situation, because while Trump himself in 1998 was violating the economic blockade of Cuba by sending people there to explore investment opportunities, that was in 1998. Now he's taking hard line and appointed this Mauricio Claver Caron, who's a real Cuban American right-winger, to the transition team. So the signs are very ominous that he may turn the clock back on some of the important concessions that the Obama administration gave. So we have to keep on the alert for that. And that obviously might set back the process in Cuba because, for example, since Obama reestablished relations in Cuba, tourism has gone up by 30% in Cuba, from 3 to 4 million tourists visiting the island. So there's a lot of things, with the Trump coming into power, a lot of things are thrown into doubt and uncertainty, and we'll find out soon enough.
Now, there's the Sino-Vietnamese model that's possibly moving along, the comeback of the total reactionary policy, perhaps, under Trump. What about possibilities of democracy and socialism and those things in Cuba? Any of that developing? Any shoots? Any green shoots?
There is a nascent left-wing opposition in Cuba that is, that I know some of them personally, some of the people involved, and with others I haven't met in person, but I have email contact with them because now it's easier to travel from Cuba, so people when they get to Miami and so on, or Mexico, wherever they happen to visit, they feel more free to communicate by email. So I'm in contact with those people. It is mostly of social democratic and anarchist inspiration, and I've written things trying to intervene in these left-wing debates or exchanges in Cuba. With what practical result, I have no idea, but I'm aware and in touch with the developments. But realistically speaking, very unfortunately, I don't think there is anything certainly in the near future that is promising along those directions. We have to keep in mind that there is a powerful pressure in Cuba for young people who are the most likely source of such resistance to leave the country. And immigration from Cuba has increased, especially since immigration rules were liberalized by the Cuban government in 2012. So in the last 4 years, it has been easier to leave Cuba. And that's why young people in Cuba, let me put it this way, the people who are discontented in Cuba are much more likely to think of leaving the country than of resisting the government at this point.
Well, this has been excellent. So I really appreciate you talking to me.
You're very welcome, Stan.
I've been speaking with Sam Farber, and we've been talking about Fidel Castro and Cuba. Thanks for listening.